everyone. Good morning again for the fourth and final time. It's nice to see everyone up and at 'em on this beautiful English morning. All right, so I'm going to take, I think, all of us maybe out of our comfort zone a little bit today and talk to you about, I think of it as the greatest scientific adventure of my life. A few years ago, was lucky enough to be part of a project in Vietnam to examine the interactions between Asian honeybees and Asian wasps. And this was funded by the National Geographic's Explorer Committee. And so we had a group of diverse people from many countries, including myself from the US, a Canadian contingent, and some researchers from Vietnam. And we all got together to move into the Vietnamese countryside and spend some time in some Asian honeybee apiaries and look at the interactions between the bees there and the wasps. And personally for me, I had never been to Vietnam before. I had never seen Asian honeybees, and I had certainly never seen their enormous, really intimidating giant hornets before. And I know in England you have some of your own invasive giant hornet fears. Vespa velutina, I understand, has very recently started jumping across from France, recently introduced to France, and has moved into into England. And it's already in Asia. But the wasp that we were looking at was called Vespa Sora. And if you can take the giant invasive wasp that you're worried about here, which is about 1 inch long, and double it. So these wasps are 2 inches long, and their wingspan can be quite enormous, up to 3 inches. I mean, they're just enormous, enormous wasps. So I'm going to tell you about our discovery of how these Asian honeybees, which are smaller than the European honeybee. I don't know, how many of you are familiar with Asian honeybees, have seen them in person? So a smattering of you across the room. You probably noticed some things about them right away. So let's meet them. This is Apis cerana, the eastern or the Asian honeybee. And they are a lot like the honeybees that we know here. They are cavity nesters, they're perennial, but they're smaller than the European honeybee, a little bit smaller, and they're fast. For those of you who have seen them, you've probably noticed just how quickly they move around. They dive bomb their entrances, and this has a lot to do with the really heavy wasp predation pressure that they experience in their native range throughout Asia. So they're found, I don't really have a great clicker here, but into Southeast Asia, part of the lower half of China, all the way up into Japan. And I'll show you a video of them in just a second, but I want to introduce you to one of their best known predators, the giant Asian hornet. And here is Vespa mandarinia. So this is a slightly different species than the one that we studied in Vietnam. This one is known throughout China. It's very well studied in Japan, where this hornet is infamous. Here it is on a man's hand. Can you see down there in the bottom left corner just how enormous it is? It has a lot of great common names, one of which is the wasp, the sparrow wasp, meaning it's essentially the size of a small bird. These things are very intimidating to look at in flight. Their sting is supposed to feel like a nail being driven into your hand. And the year that we were in Vietnam studying its sister species, Vespa Sora, this species, Vespa mandarinia, killed 40 people in China. So its sting is pretty lethal to the wrong person and painful to everyone ubiquitously. And as wasps, they are very interesting. They have very interesting biology. Most wasps are solitary hunters. So they do live in social colonies, but they fly out, find prey, some form of insect meat usually, bring that prey back on their own to the colony, mash it up, and feed it to their offspring. These wasps, Vespa mandarinia, are known to hunt quite differently. I always tell my students they hunt like lions, basically. They hunt in a pack. One of the scout wasps will locate a target, mark it with a pheromone, And then that pheromone recruits its nestmates to that target, and they will strike colonies and together as a group wipe out if they're attacking honeybees, the Asian honeybee, they'll wipe out the honeybee and then occupy the nest and for weeks carry away the larvae that are inside, the larvae and pupae, and use those to feed to their offspring. So they work together to destroy Asian honeybee colonies and take over the protein-rich brood that they carry. So this is quite an unusual strategy for a wasp. Like I said, most are solitary hunters. So here is an image of the size difference between Apis cerana and Vespa mandarinia. Quite impressive, right? This is a really, when I say formidable predator, that's what I mean. This is a really nasty looking wasp. I will say in person, I didn't see Vespa mandarinia. Like I said, we were looking at Vespa Sora, which is equivalent in size basically to Vespa mandarinia in Vietnam. They're beautiful to watch in person if you're a bug nerd like myself. It's just fun because it's a big bug. You can see everything happening on it while it's operating. It's not like something you have to look at with a videotape or under a microscope. They were fun to work with. And they're very focused on the colonies, so you can get quite close to them. And you'll see from some of the videos I'm going to show you that we were up close and personal with these guys while they were hunting these Asian honeybees. So I'm going to tell you a fairly well-characterized story that is known from the interactions between Asian honeybees and Vespa mandarinia, the Asian giant hornet, known from Japan. And this is a really famous story that I tell every single class that I teach because I think it tells us a lot of lessons about evolution and animal behavior and social insects in particular, and I teach all of those classes. So what happens, we know from a paper that was published in 1995, by a Japanese group, was basically, this is a very dark image, and I know it's hard to see. It's the original picture from the paper. I'm going to show you some of my own brighter images and videos. But this female wasp, this giant hornet, has discovered the entrance board of a colony, and she is dragging her abdomen across the front of that entrance. And they have a very robust gland that secretes a lot of pheromones on the underside of their abdomen, and it's presumed that this Van der Vet gland, it's called, releases and leaves a trail of pheromone on the target hive, after which you get mass attack of the bees, you can see, or the wasps, you can see in the bottom corner. And these wasps are so prolific at killing, they have some interesting stats. They can kill about 40 bees a minute. A colony of 30 wasps can attack an Asian honeybee nest with 30,000 individuals and wipe them out in 3 hours. It's the rule of threes. 3 hours, 30 wasps, 30,000 bees gone. And then those wasps will take up residence within the nest and shuttle larvae back and forth, like I said, to their own offspring. So in Japan, our tiny little Asian honeybee heroes have a really great way of defending themselves against this attack. If they can sense the presence of the first scout and stop her from being able to leave her target mark on that colony, they can shut down the entire attack. They can stop recruitment to them as a target. And they do this by balling that scout wasp. When they get very agitated when a wasp shows up, and if the wasp lands and is still long enough, they'll swarm her, wrap themselves around her, and start shivering their thoracic muscles. You can see on the bottom right, this is what an infrared image of them looks like. They start to heat themselves up. And they heat themselves up hot enough that they cook the wasp to death, but their thermal limit is about 2 degrees higher, the bees. So they get just to the point where they're about to start dying, and it's hot enough to cook the wasp in the center of that ball. So this heat balling is an effective way of trying to shut down these attacks by these enormous wasp predators. And it turns out through subsequent work, it's not just heat, it's also suffocation. So the action of the bees working hard to stay warm reduces the increases carbon dioxide within the heat ball, and so they both heat and choke the wasps to death, which is really interesting. Very few bees die in this process. It seems like they somehow rotate around within the ball. We saw some of these heat balls in Vietnam, and the bees are wriggling around, and it seems like being able to move out of the center of the ball, like this molten lava kind of flowing thing, which is interesting. Okay, so that's the story that we know well between the Asian honeybee and the giant Asian hornet from Japan, Vespa mandarinia. So let me introduce you to Vespa Sora, who is in the bottom corner here on the far right. It used to be thought that Vespa Sora was a subspecies of Vespa mandarinia that was found in its southern range. It's since been elevated to its own species. So they are very closely related, but they're geographically somewhat different in their location. Mandarinia is more northern, Sora is more southern, in Vietnam where we were. And also in my impression, although I haven't seen mandarinia in person, only in images, is that Sora seems to be slightly more yellow. And some people call mandarinia the tiger-headed wasp. They have a whole bunch of really interesting names that kind of allude to their predatory nature and their dangerous nature. I had heard about Vespa Sora, and I was invited by my former PhD advisor, Gard Otis, from the University of Guelph, and we basically built this proposal to try and investigate a phenomenon that he had been seeing in his colonies, or not his colonies, the Vietnamese beekeepers he was working with. He was working in Vietnam on development projects, trying to help beekeepers learn more about how to keep bees economically viably to improve, the money that they could make from working with bees. And while he was there, he noticed some interesting things over the years. So can you see this image very easily? This is an image of our apiary. I'm sure it's quite different from what you're used to working in England, or what I'm used to working in Boston or in Canada. These apiaries are quite wet. It rains a lot. It's very, very humid. It was about 40 degrees Celsius almost every day that we were there. So quite, I know, that boils the English blood, doesn't it? The thought of that, yeah. Very hot, humid all the time. And remarkably, everyone drank hot soup for breakfast. So it was just like really hard for me too as a Canadian. I can sympathize with your looks. But these apiaries were fascinating. They basically put the colonies on metal stands so that they were up above the wet ground, the mud of the ground, and they had put metal roofs over all of them so that they would shed water from the pretty nearly daily rains that we were experiencing there. And Apis cerana colonies are smaller than Apis mellifera colonies. The content of water in the honey is a lot higher, so they don't really store a lot of it. They tend to consume it very quickly, and so when it's harvested fast. And so the colonies in general are not as big as European colonies, nor do they have as much honey in them, if that makes sense. So the colonies and the boxes that you're looking at are quite a bit smaller, but these are normal sized boxes. And if we take a close-up look of these boxes, you can see on the left that you can see the front of the box, and on the right you have the bees at their entrance, and you see how tiny the little slit is that the beekeepers have created to let them in. And this is essentially to ensure that wasps don't get into the colonies. I know in my own colonies at certain times of the year I can open up my colonies at home and find yellow jackets in there, or sometimes even bumblebees trying to steal a few bites of honey from weaker colonies. These predatory wasps are constantly at these colonies. And so the beekeepers have created tiny entrances for these small bees to get into, but these large Vespa Sora have such huge mandibles, they just are like saws at the entrance, and they'll start chewing away at the entrance of the colony to make it big enough so they can get their big heads into the colony. So most beekeepers have a metal grate around this that prevents the bees or the wasps from chewing. We had to work to find beekeepers who were willing to work with us and let the wasps attack their colonies, or at least be around their colonies. So we were actually working in apiaries where the beekeepers had agreed to remove these metal grates from their entrances. But they were very nervous about us. You know, it did take a lot of convincing and some basically money. We had to pay the beekeepers to agree to let us study the wasps in their yards, because they were so nervous about letting the wasps attack their colonies. They're quite brutal. And they go out with electrified tennis rackets at the times of the day when the wasp predation pressure is the highest, and they just knock them out of the air and electrocute them, trying to keep the predation pressure down. It's really intense. Okay, so this is what the hives looked like that we were looking at, or that we were studying. And when we were working with beekeepers, here's one of them, and I mentioned before how different the behaviors are of Apis cerana in response to this heavy predation pressure from wasps. So they do things, it was really wonderful to see them for the first time, because I was just kind of like, wow, this is so different than the European bees that I'm used to working with. They do this shimmering activity where they wag their hind end in a and a sort of visual display that's meant to be alarming. It is alarming. The first time I saw it, I didn't want to go near the nest until you get used to it. And they also hiss when they're shimmering. So you can't hear it in the videos that I'm going to play because I turned down the volume because we're all talking about things while the videos are playing. But it's like ksh, 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 the entire time they're hissing. Or they're shimmering. And you'll see in the video they're also very fast flyers. They don't land gently on the landing board like we see our European bees doing. They dive bomb them. They come in like this and go into the entrance. So they're trying to zigzag and keep away from the wasps that are at them. And when there's a wasp in front, they very often come out and do this shimmering and hissing behavior. So highly reactive, really excitable, noisy, vigorous little bees. They're very, very interesting and fun to watch. So here's a video. Hopefully it will play correctly. And what you're going to see is a little tiny beard, a mustache of bees outside, hissing at, I believe, right here. Right there. There's a Vespa velutina, so the smaller giant wasp that has been invasive in Europe. And so it is hawking, meaning it's hovering at the entrance, getting ready to grab any bee that wasp is able to grab. She's sort of facing outwards, looking for inward coming bees, and the bees behind her are hissing and shimmering at her. See how they're waggling in coordination? And you can see the busy flashes you see are actually bees zipping past the entrance, sort of evaluating when they can go in, and then they'll hit that entrance and go in really fast. Pretty interesting, huh? A lot more reactive than what we see with the European bees. Okay, so that's what they look like to me on day one. That's normal speed, good question, yeah. So what Gard noticed on his years of development work in Vietnam was that some of the colonies he went up to had entrances that were extraordinarily what he called spotty. And he noticed this initially and just kept noticing it, didn't say much about it. And eventually he saw it so often, and sometimes to this heavy degree. This is an extraordinarily heavily spotted entrance, and you'll see some of my images. It's not quite this spotty, but some can get quite this spotty. Eventually, he started asking beekeepers about it, and many of them who were learning about bees didn't really, were paying attention to other things and hadn't really noticed the spots and didn't have much to say about them. A handful of them, though, who had more experience would say things like, "Oh, that means the big wasp has been here." And when he asked which big wasp, some of them didn't really have a great sense of, because there are a whole bunch of wasps in Asia, from velutina up to Sora, lots of predatory pressure. We saw many other wasp species when we were there. Some of them would say the big wasp, the giant wasp, and when we contacted our Vietnamese wasp expert, that was Vespa Sora. And then one beekeeper, the only beekeeper that Gard ever spoke to who had been paying attention to this, said, "It's from animals. That's from the manure in the fields. I saw a bee collecting it once, and they put it on the hive for the big wasps," which is a mystery, right? What does all of that mean? That sounds very intriguing. So we know in Japan they have this really well-characterized heat balling defense against the big wasp there, the giant wasp there. So Gard started wondering, what is this hive spotting about, and is it truly in response to the big wasps that they have in Vietnam? So here's one image with the entrance you can see kind of poking out in the bottom there. Here's a yellow colony that shows a little bit less spotting, but against the yellow you can see quite clearly that there is a lot of something on that colony, right? So the question is, what is it? And really, we had so many questions. Armed with only this knowledge, we wrote to the National Geographic Society and asked them to fund this explorers experiment with a team of international people to go over to Vietnam and spend some time trying to look at this potentially novel defense in Vietnam to their version of the giant wasp, like is so well known in Japan. So our questions were multiple. We wanted to know if Vespa Sora hunted like Vespa mandarinia. Does it have a similar biology? We expected that it probably would, but we didn't really know. When it came to the spots, we wanted to know what they were made of. Did the bees put them there? When did it occur? When did the bees know to start spotting? Was it something like a standing defense? A lot of animals will invest in defense all the time, and then others will have strategies where they invest in that strategy only when it's time to, because it's an effort to do so. So that kind of constitutive versus inducible defense. So we wanted to know, when did the bees start spotting? Is the spotting in response to a scout, the same way that the bees in Japan would ball a scout if they were getting attacked by their giant wasp? And how does Vespa Sora respond to these spots? We just had so many questions with zero answer. So this is where, as a scientist, normally I'm building on the work of the giants before me, trying to figure out the next piece of a big puzzle that's laid out before all of us. And I really felt, for the first time with this team in Vietnam, it was fun. We really had no idea, what we were going to figure out or how it was going to work. And we were there for about a month to figure all of this stuff out. And it got to the point where we felt like we were making discoveries every day, and it was very, very thrilling to get up in the morning. So you can see here a colony that on the bottom here has, on this side, the left side, it has essentially no spots. And then on the right side, can see colonies with variable spotting, a little bit more than what we saw in those heavily spotted images before. So, question. Does Vespa Sora hunt in the same way as the giant wasps that are well known from Japan and nearby? And the answer is yes. When we were in these yards, we would see a single wasp show up at colonies, and then gradually that number of wasps would build up. The most we ever saw at a single attack was 8 before the beekeeper came out and asked us to shut down the attack, to basically close up the entrance, and he was very nervous about the number of wasps that were starting to show up at this one colony. But for the number of times we did see the buildup of this attack go from solitary wasps to multiple wasps, what we would see initially is a wasp at the entrance dragging her abdomen on usually the front, usually very close to the entrance, wagging it back and forth, and I'll show you a video of that in just a second. And then within a period of time, there would be multiple wasps showing up. And we would see these wasps, the first, we called them wag draggers, sort of rubbing their abdomen across the hive. And then they would go up to leaves above the tree and rub on leaves, and we could see them flying away. We think maybe building a trail towards wherever their nest is, but we were never able to follow them that far. So let me show you a video. These are all handheld as we're running around with video cameras in these apiaries trying to see how everything's working. And this is a close-up of a wasp. You can see her moving across the entrance, prominently dragging her abdomen. And on the base of that abdomen, right near the tip of her stinger, is a triangular gland called the Van der Veck gland that in Mandarinia is known to be the source of that scouting marking pheromone. All right, so everybody saw that? Let me show you the next video. Here we go, of multiple wasp attack. At this point, the colony is built up. You can see, and if I'll play it long enough, you can see some tiny Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee, sort of dive bombing the entrance and trying to zoom their way in. But the wasps, without the ability to get inside, start doing what that one is doing, headbutting the entrance. Eventually, they'll start chewing the opening. They could remove about 1 centimeter's worth of wood in a couple of hours from around the band of that entrance before the beekeepers would ask us to put the metal bands back on. This is an intimidating scene, isn't it? Think about these wasps. They're this big, flying around this entrance, headbutting, and we put microphones inside of these colonies. The bees are freaking out inside. They are hissing, buzzing. We don't even know all the noises that they're making inside, but they're very upset inside and making a lot of sound. All right. So back to the question of hive spotting. And we wanted to know a little bit more about where these spots came from. What exactly was going on the entrances of these colonies? And you saw in that mass attack video I just showed you, there were spots around that entrance that weren't there on the previous video when the scout had just shown up. And a lot of these colonies, when we arrived in Vietnam, were very spotty. So we had a crew go through all of the apiaries and really heavily scrub down the colonies. So when we started these studies, we started with clean colonies, and then the images you see here on out are the number of spots that were applied over the course of the month that we were in our study yards. Okay, so what are the spots, and are they from the bees? Well, based on the good information from this very observant beekeeper who said he thought he saw the bees foraging on dung in his animal fields, we decided that was candidate number one to try and figure out what the spots were. Smelling them directly, we tried. It didn't smell good. It didn't smell, if everything had an unusual smell, so we were in a new country, it was kind of hard to just by smelling it tell. It didn't smell great, but we couldn't identify anything. So we decided, knowing that Apis cerana does not forage very far, these bees only forage about 1 kilometer away from their homes, which is another interesting difference from Apis mellifera. We started meeting the neighbors and introducing ourselves. Well, luckily we had our Vietnamese collaborators who could, introduce us as the English people. And they thought we had a strange request. We wanted to hang out in their barns with their animals and look at their dung. So I spent a lot of time in this pig stall with this mom and all these piglets. I have a lot of videos of sleeping piglets, and I wrote in my field notes, the pigs are adorable, I do not see any bees. We went and looked in chicken coops, we met the local cows, and we did this for a couple of days, and then eventually I had the great luck of being in an abandoned a latrine for people that had been converted into a chicken coop. So as you can imagine, it was not a pleasant place to be in on a 40-degree day, but it turned out to be the first place we saw the bees actually foraging on dung. And it was a dark environment, but we could hear the bees in there, and somebody called me over and I camped out in there for a couple of hours until I finally, under some boards, found the bees foraging in some of there was a scummy soap cup that was hanging on the wall, and then some piles of chicken dung underneath some boards and boxes. And the bees were actually flying in a back window and picking things up from this dried dung and soap scum. And so the first thing we did was start shoveling all of the manure and bringing it back directly into the apiary so that if we could, in the light of day with fresh air, we could see the bees foraging on the dung more directly. And that's what we saw in these piles of manure that we collected up and brought in daily to our study site. We would find bees, you could see in the bottom right, in her mandibles. This is not pollen or anything from the colony. This is a little hunk of something she rooted out of the pile of dung that we had delivered to her in the nest. So this is what we called the Manure Buffet. So gross. Underneath a tarp, lots of piles of dung from all different types of animals, and it turned out that the bees preferred chicken, and I think the other favorite was pig. Some of the types of dung we brought, they completely ignored, and they would go back to their favorites. And individual, like Tom was saying yesterday with water collecting, we'd have the same bees coming back to the same spots on the dung piles, and then some of the dung piles being completely ignored. So here's a shot up close for your viewing pleasure. And we started marking these bees with paint as they were coming to the dung piles. And then we could see the same bees returning to the entrances with stuff in their mandibles and applying it to the entrances. So I have some videos of that. I apologize for 9 o'clock in the morning making you look at chicken poop, but it is fascinating. I mean, I took so many videos of bees foraging on filth that, and that's what, the technical category for it, when they're just collecting dirty things like dung or soap scum, we saw them foraging on urine, pots of urine, just stinky things. Technically, you call it filth. Okay, so here is a video of, I'm going to zoom in for you to the tiny bee on a pile of manure, and once it comes into focus, which will be in a second, you'll see all of the other, there's fly larvae and tiny invertebrates crawling around in this soup of feces. And she is very specifically, we saw them doing this often, rolling up a ball of something and like picking specific things out of the pile. And you see she's got that little pile in her mouth of filth, and she just flew away. So video number 2 will be not the same bee, but a marked bee, a different set of colors, that we got a good video of her just having returned from the manure buffet, and she's busily working at affixing that pile of dung to the entrance of the colony. And then they tend to run around the entrance a lot. They also flash a gland, which, we just feel like there's so much going on here that we were figuring out the first steps, but there's a lot of other stuff probably happening in this video as well, like signaling that we still need to uncover. Okay, so Gard reached out to his collaborators throughout Vietnam and started saying, can you go out to the people you work with in apiaries? A lot of these people were extension specialists, like the Vietnamese version of extension specialists, people who knew beekeepers in the area, and asked them if they've seen images like this kind of spotting on hives. And it turned out, so Vietnam is in red, if you're not geographically minded, on the left image. And you can see all throughout this long country, for everywhere we basically asked people to ask beekeepers whether or not they had seen spotting. We got reports back of, yeah, they actually have seen stuff like this. So it seems to be, at least in Vietnam, pretty widespread. So then we wanted to know a little bit more about how quickly these spots get added. Because like I said, when we showed up in this yard, a lot of the colonies had a high level of spotting. Some of them had no spotting. So we needed to get a sense of how quickly these were added and in response to what kind of action from the wasps. So what we did is in our 3 yards, and you'll see over time, basically we go from day 0 where the colonies were cleaned, and we had a lot of colonies that we looked at, over 330 colonies, 337 specifically. Across these 3 apiaries, over the course of 10 days, we went back on day 5 and day 10 and just did a scan of the apiaries to see how many of the colonies had started to spot. So we learned some interesting things just from this. First of all, the spotting seems to be additive. The colonies that are spotting are adding spots over time, but there are certainly colonies in the yard that once cleaned from whatever historical spotting they had were not adding new spots over the course of the time that we were there. And the yard where we saw the most Sora in green is the one where we could really see the highest level of spotting too. So that's kind of anecdotal, cross-correlating those two things, but we learned that the spots do get added over time, and not every colony is actively adding spots as sort of a standing defense against, a potential defense against these wasps. So our next thing was to try and figure out when exactly these bees start spotting, more specifically in response to exposure to the chemicals from the scouts. The scouts that, remember the wag dragging along the entrance, where they're marking that colony as a target for en masse recruitment of their sisters to come back and get that colony. So we created 3 different types of treatments, and this was kind of we were amazed that we were able to do this in a tropical jungle in Vietnam. The Vietnamese people are very resourceful, and if you tell them, it'd be really great if we can get some ether, all of a sudden you have ether. I don't even know where it came from, but they were doing these things, and we were amazed. So what we decided to do was to present hives with one of 3 treatments. The first was Vespa Sora van der Weckland extract. So I would dissect out this, and you can see in the bottom, this is from Mandarinia. This is an image from that initial Japanese paper in 1995. The underside of the abdomen, right at the tip with the sting coming out. Can you all see that from where you're sitting? And that brighter yellow spot is the actual van der Weck gland. So you can dissect that out, cut out the little triangle of it, soak it in ether, and presumably the hydrocarbons it produces to mark the hive should soak into the ether and kind of make a cocktail of scouting pheromone. We also, the same group, the same Ono group from Japan, had in 2003 identified some of the major components of that marking pheromone, and we were able to get our hands on the major component, the primary component of that pheromone for Mandarinia. So we had Sora extract from the actual glands, and then we had Mandarinia synthetic pheromone, basically. And then our third treatment was just an ether control, so a blank, basically. Does that make sense? Okay, great. All right, so we would paint these 3 things onto pieces of paper and then pin them at the entrance of the colonies. And what we wanted to get a sense of was, how did this chemical stimulation, how did it change the appearance of spots? Did it cause spots, and if it did, at what level? And we also noticed that once we started applying these square pieces of paper, that the bees would come out and start chewing heavily at the area around the paper. Like, they seemed very agitated about having the paper there, and they would chew at the paper itself and at the area around the paper. So we started counting that too. But first, to do all of this work, you need to have Vespa Sora to get the van der Weck glands out of, right? And so to do that, we discovered a really handy trick. In Vietnam, a lot of people harvest Hornet or Wasp colonies. And they do this for a lot of different reasons. Some people think that the extracts from them are medicinal. The Japanese believe that Vespa mandarinia has longevity-inducing properties. And so there's a belief amongst many people that consumption of wasp products will help increase your vigor and lifespan and all of that kind of stuff. Some people just use them in cooking. So you can actually, we went down the streets in Hanoi and we would see motorcyclists with bags of wasps on their back, literally like butterfly cages, you know, the kind you give to preschoolers to hatch out their monarch butterfly, or whatever kind of butterflies you have in the UK. They would be hanging over their backs like backpacks filled with a swarm of wasps that were going off to somebody to market. So it turned out that there are people in Vietnam who we called Vespaculturists, so like apiculturists, but they're working with Vespa. And we drove an hour to meet a family that specialized in this. And we told him we wanted to buy some of his Sora colonies, and he said it was $100 a colony, and we said, great, we'll take 3. So he suited up. This is him putting on this is his family at the right. You can see he's got 3 pairs of gloves that he puts on over his hands to work with these guys because their sting is so strong, and not just, you know, in chemical strength, but the actual physical sting is so strong it can puncture these gloves. So he's suiting up for us, and again, remember this is in 40°C weather, putting on 3 layers of gloves, a full suit. They tied a potato sack around his head and then knotted it at the bottom. So this was his, you know, his Vespaculturist outfit. It was really fun. This was like a great day, the day we went to go buy these wasps. And here are some of his hanging colonies. So these are colonies that go out in nature and find them occurring naturally. They cut them down at night, wrap them up, tie them up, and then the colonies mature at their homes, and then they sell these colonies when they are fully mature. And here is one of the Sora colonies we purchased. It's not a great image because we were very far away. The Vespaculturist really did not want us getting close to these things, and we decided to agree with his expertise. And this is a zoomed-in shot with a long lens from far away, but he had basically been told about the location of this colony. He'd gone in the middle of the night, capped the entrance of it, dug up around it, scooped the whole thing up, and transplanted the whole mess from the ground to a hole in his own ground, and then let the colony mature, and he would sell these to people like us or, you know, whoever else wanted to buy Vespa. So this is where we got our Sora colonies. And it was just it was like the coolest thing to meet these people and learn about all this stuff and, you know, meet new insects basically up close and personal, really powerful insects. So if I can show you some of the squares from this paper treatment where we treated these papers with different versions of chemicals, you can see at the top we have our control. The bees bait with just the ether on it, nothing soaked in the ether. The bees pretty much ignored them. They didn't spot them. They didn't chew them. Mandarinia with the synthetic chemical extract, we got a little bit more activity on them, some spotting and some chewing, and you can see at the bottom the Vespa Sora. If the pin is there, it means they completely removed the paper. They chewed at it so vigorously that the whole thing was taken away. So they're spotting those pretty actively, they're chewing them intensively, and in some cases removing them entirely. So when we looked overall at the number of colonies with sham, mandarinia, and Sora, we have a much higher frequency of papers being spotted if there is in fact that Sora extract on those papers. So we're getting some hints here about what's happening. And we also found that the total number of spots on the hives itself. So they were spotting the papers, but we would go back 24 hours later and count the number of spots at the entrance. And we also had a crew of Vietnamese students who would stand at these colonies and bat away all other wasps over the course of the day. So the only exposure that they had was these chemical laced pieces of paper that we put in front of them for that day. And so by the end of the day, if they had been exposed to a piece of paper with Van der Vekland chemicals from the Sora, we got way more spotting on the entrances of those colonies compared to virtually, close to nothing on the other 2 groups. So what do the spots do? The question is, do they mask the pheromones? Do they repel the wasps? We had a sense from the reams of videotapes that we were taking and all the hours that we were spending hanging out in these yards and looking at these colonies that the wasps seemed less likely to land on spots and to chew at the entrances of these colonies when there were spots on them. So our next our next thrust of investigation was to try and understand how these, so we knew the chemicals were affecting the spotting behavior of the bees. The next question is, how does the behavior of the spotting behavior of the bees affect the behavior of the wasps? Can it actually help to shut down some of these attacks in the same way that heat balling does for the giant wasp in Japan? So we just went out and videotaped a ton of stuff the whole month that we were there. And in total, we had 280 videotapes of single wasp attacks on colonies within our 3 yards. Specifically, I mean, really, mostly we got all of these videos from Apiary 3, this really heavily attacked colony, or heavily attacked apiary. We didn't know why it was so heavily attacked. All of these apiaries were about 3 kilometers away from each other, and to us, they didn't look all that different. We don't know anything about how far Vespa Sora will fly to find its targets. We don't know the location of the wasps who were attacking the bees in those colonies, but we do know that they were heavily attacked. So in that yard, we would have a range of types of spotting or degrees of spotting on the colonies. So I hope you can see from where you're sitting, that's a very clean hive front near the entrance. Can you see how clean that is from where you are? And then the one in the middle has got a moderate spotting around the top of the entrance and a heavier spotting on the landing board. And then on the far right, 150A is heavily spotted, lots of gray and white all over. And in some places, it's just a carpet of these spots that are on the colony. So we scored the level of spotting from 0 to 4, with 0 being clean, 4 being the worst spotting we had seen, like this carpet of spotting around the entrance on the far right. And then we watched these videos and tried to assess how much time, when the colonies did get attacked, depending on the degree of spotting, how much time the wasps spent landing on the colonies and how much time they spent chewing on the colonies. Does that make sense? Okay, so here's what we found. And the first little bit, so the spotting scales on the bottom, we've got from 0, very clean, to 4, heavily spotted, and the mean time per wasp that they spent landed on the entrance, landed on the hive at all. And blue is right on the entrance, so like some part of their body in contact with the perimeter of that entrance, either looking in or chewing it just below it or chewing on the side of it, or a leg sort of touching it, if their body was in contact with the entrance. And then in red, it's the time that they spent on the hive front if they were slightly off of the entrance. So in total, it's complete landing time divided into right near the entrance or away from the entrance. And across the spotting scale, the landing time decreased substantially. Basically, the more heavily spotted the colonies were. And then we looked at chewing as well. And here's the shot at the bottom. You can see this wasp did this kind of chewing damage in about 20 minutes. I know. You could hear the wood flying off the front of the colonies standing 4 feet away. It was like chew, 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 chew. It was unbelievable how powerful these wasps are. They are so strong. So across that spotting scale from 0 to 4, we calculated the mean number of time that the wasps spent chewing as well. So that was significantly lower if the wasps were on a heavily spotted colony. They spent, from basically 2 onwards, that middle spotting level, they spent a lot less time landed and chewing on the entrances as well. And the chewing is the big part, right? We all know our bees like colonies with small entrances. The beekeepers specifically build these colonies so that the entrances are small to help keep these big wasp predators out. And so this chewing ability that they have is a great tool in their toolkit that the wasps have to get in. And it turns out that these dung spots, or whatever kind of filth they're spotting with, is helping to reduce that chewing time as well. So I have a video here of, it's a heavily spotted colony, lots of spotting around the entrance, and I believe there are at least 2 wasps in this video, and you'll see, unlike the previous videos we looked at, where they're very focused on trying to look in the entrance, remember how they were on the landing board and at the landing board, looking in, kind of trying to reach in. You'll see in this video that they aren't doing that at all. They're crawling up around the sides. So you see them kind of hovering, sort of hesitant to land. When they land on the clean parts up near the side where there aren't really lots of spots. back out again. We've got another one hovering in the entrance, sort of landing briefly, it takes off right away, like very hesitant to stay. Whereas in the other attacks, they tend to land, chew, look in, walk around, lots of stuff. And here I have them up near the top where they are in a cleaner environment. So we don't know why exactly these spots are so disagreeable to these wasps. I can guess personally why I would want to land on such a site. The Apis cerana themselves don't seem bothered by it. They are on these entrances with tons of spotting, and they'll hang out and shimmer and flash at the wasps on a carpet of these spots. But the wasps themselves do not seem to. We have pretty good evidence that shows they are much less likely to get close to that entrance with the spots there. We don't know if it's repellents, we have no idea, basically. We don't know if the right cues are no longer there and they're not sure where to land. They seem to understand. They seem like very smart insects. That's a lot to say about an insect, but they seem very intentional when you're watching them, like they know what they mean to do. So we have a lot of questions here, but some answers from this month of what we looked at. We know that Apis cerana actually collects dung and other forms of filth, the things that we were able to see them in our month-long time there, and that's pretty remarkable. We know Apis in general to collect not very many things from flowers, water, and propolis, basically tree resin. We don't really understand them to use other things to bring back to their homes. So we don't know if they're recruiting to these manure buffets that we're providing them, if there are specialists that like filth and everyone else deals with the good stuff. We really don't know. There are just a ton of questions left to be answered. But it is remarkable that they are collecting filth and that they are potentially using it as a tool or a weapon to try and fend off these really large, formidable wasp predators. And we do know that this hive spotting seems to really be triggered by these initial cues that the scouting wasps leave on the colony to mark them as a target. But like I said, lots of stuff left to understand. We don't know if the dung and other forms of filth help to mask the scouting. We don't know if it's just generally repugnant to the wasps and helps to keep them away in that way as well, or maybe both things are operating at once. And like I said, we did put one of these colonies into an observation hive, which was really fun. At the Vietnam Bee Research Center, they had never worked with observation hives before, so we had to go to a carpenter to build us one in Hanoi. And then when I put it together, they had never seen duct tape before, so they kept calling it my magic tape that I would use to keep the glass on the side. It was just a great experience because we were just from such different worlds with different experiences. They had such good understanding of their bees and the wasp predators, and we needed to soak that up, and we had a lot of experimental methods to study these guys that we brought in that they had not been exposed to before either. So it was a lot of fun. It was a great research, knowledge, cultural exchange in many ways. So I think I will leave it at that. I just want to thank the National Geographic Society for funding the work, and then the team of people that we had doing this work for the time that we were there. Olivia Knight was a grad student at the University of Guelph. There's Gard, my PhD advisor from Guelph, with the yellow box in his hand. And our two Vietnamese colleagues, Lian and Hang, who basically are the wasp guru and the local Apis cerana specialist for the country. And they had a variety of students that worked with us as well. So we had a really great time working with them. And here's us in the field the Vietnamese were great. They have a great tradition of 10 o'clock tea. So every day, even though we were in this really humid, muddy field, they would run an extension cord out to the apiary from the local house, boil up some water, and we would all have tea time at 10 o'clock. It was a really great, as a North American, it's not something I'm used to, and it was really fabulous to do this in the middle of a steamy bee yard in Vietnam, watching wasps. So I'd be happy to take questions. Thanks for your attention.
I was wondering, for the Apis cerana colonies that were heavily under attack and had a lot of spotting, what's the honey taste like?
That's a really good question. I mean, we wondered about that constantly. We didn't eat it, but there is the question of using this filth in an environment that is hot, humid, full of resources. The honey is not as, it has a lot more water in it. It ferments quickly. So, the reason why our honey has such a high shelf life is because of the low water content in it. It doesn't allow microbes to grow in it. So we wondered that question all the time. I really hope we don't spend a 10-minute question and answer period with me saying, yeah, I'd like to know that too. But it's very possible we might. I think that's a really important question to ask. What is the effect on the actual food products that are in the hive for the bees and the human consumers? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was fascinating.
Good.
I really just want to know just really what you might think what the dung is doing. Is there potentially either a microbiological reason, whether it's a fungus or something that is repelling the Vespa?
Yeah, we don't know. So I'm sorry, but we agree with you. It could either be, it seems like two different categories to say something is repellent versus masking cues. Those are two different things. For us, it would be two different things. It would be different motivators for staying away. So we don't know if it's the dung itself or things that then, because a lot of times, these colonies, although we cleaned them when we first arrived, and then everything we saw thereafter was recent filth spotting, we have no sense of whether or not the colonies that were heavily spotted, how active that spotting is as it ages against future attacks. We don't know if it produces things thereafter that make it more effective, or if it loses efficacy and then has to be revamped with new filth. We really don't know. I think there are about 25 PhDs that could be done with this work. That's maybe an exaggeration, but definitely it needs a whole crew of people, looking at this at a bunch of different angles, microbiologists, chemists, lots of different people.
I have a question about whether you would get a sense of whether it's a learnt behaviour. So if you actually got a virgin colony where none of the occupants had done any spotting, whether they would actually do this, or what's your feeling on that?
My feeling is that it probably isn't, because that would be implying it would be a culturally transmitted piece of knowledge then that some colonies had learned and maybe passed down, and that's a really far stretch to give to insects. A lot of things that we think are in the realm of human life only, we start learning, oh wait, killer whales do that, or oh, wait, primates, elephants, dogs, lots of things do that, like learning and teaching and cultural transmission. I am not aware of any kind of cultural transmission in insects, and it would, so many of the wonderful behavioral phenomena that they demonstrate are all part of their DNA. It's, natural selection has put it into their genomes, and they don't need to learn many of the really spectacular things that they do, like waggle dancing. So I would err on the side of that versus a learned response. Oh, hi.
Has any work been done on the size of the entrances in the natural population of the bees versus what the Apis mellifera bees search out when they're looking for a new home?
One challenge of doing this kind of research is a language barrier. We can't access a lot of the previous research that's been done in the field. It's great to have collaborators like Leanne and Hein, but basically they also have a problem with access to the literature themselves. Oftentimes they would write us and ask us to get papers for them that then they would read in a language they understood. It's all that to say is we don't have great access to historical information about Apis cerana, so I don't know if that information exists. I know it does for Apis mellifera, and that they prefer smaller entrances, and I would bet that these guys prefer very small entrances too, because they're smaller colonies, they're living in hotter environments, they're very fast. They don't tend to hang out at the entrance as much unless there's Vespa pressure there. So I would guess that, like Apis mellifera, they would like a small entrance to help. They've probably been selected to have that sort of thing to help them out with this kind of wasp pressure. That's my guess. Certainly, the beekeepers have picked up on how much a small entrance helps their bees.
Can I ask?
Where are you?
Up here.
Oh, hi.
Do you think this tactic would work if beekeepers spread chicken filth around the entrances of their hives themselves?
That's a good question. I don't know. I really don't know. I remember after we left, there was some question about whether or not this would be a good anti-wasp strategy for beekeepers. And I remember some initial trials that Leanne and Hank did, trying to see if they could get an anti-predation pressure down by applying filth themselves. They didn't delve too deeply into it. They don't have a lot of resources, and they have a lot of other demands on their time. So it was a big deal when we showed up with money from the National Geographic Society. It supported a lot of research that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. So they did a small trial that they didn't feel was successful, but we mostly felt like it wasn't large enough to really know. But I think that's a good question to ask and pursue further. It's possible. But it's also possible that the bees, you saw that worker in the chicken dung being very specific about what she was taking. So we don't know if, it has to be that piece of filth versus something else. Yeah, I'm sorry, I keep saying, I don't know. Great question, I don't know.
To answer this one.
Yeah.
I was fascinated to hear that there were some hives that weren't spotted, so presumably they just got wiped out.
No, they were in there. But it seems like the bees don't take up this behavior unless they're getting attacked. We really only saw the colonies. We weren't there every hour, but we were there at 7 o'clock in the morning till about 5 o'clock at night. And the beekeepers felt like the attacks got the heaviest around 10 o'clock. We felt like we were there to see what was going on. And we really hung out at Apiary 3. Once we figured out it was the hot spot, we were there all the time, basically. So the colonies that had minor visitation didn't seem to respond. It was when they got a lot of attention that things started to get heavier in terms of the spotting.
So why did those hives not get a lot of attention?
I don't know. It could be because of previous marks, or just if you have 60 hives in front of you and you're one wasp and you're going to target something, you can't target all 60. You're going to pick some victims and start harassing. And it did seem like they would come back to the same ones over and over again, and we don't know why. But all of the colonies had bees in them. So when you see those blank entrances, very often the bees would just retreat inside the colony and not come out. And they were so interesting. I feel like with Apis mellifera, you've sat at your entrances watching foraging. You know that even on days when there's not a lot of stuff out there, or times of day when there's not a lot of floral resources, there's still traffic at the entrance. You still have a sense of life from a normally sized colony. These guys would just look lifeless for hours, and then all of a sudden something changed in the environment and everyone would start foraging intensively in the yard for a couple of hours, and then it would really die down and look lifeless again. Everybody was back inside the hive. It was so different than it's just really interesting to meet a bee that is so the cousin of a bee you know so well and has similarities but so many crucial differences too in how they behave.
Hello, can you hear? Just wondering whether it's possible that the dung is actually a physical barrier rather than a chemical one, because with the Asian hornet, they're talking about putting small pins to make it more difficult. Mm-hmm. Is that the cerana's version of that? Is that possible?
I think it's possible. The thing is, if that were the point, to try and reduce the size of the entrance to make it harder for big things to get inside, they already can't get inside, but still they could have this behavior where they want to make it even smaller. We spent a lot of time looking at wet mud near the dung piles that we had, looking to see if the bees were also collecting mud, and because that is the more freely available thing, and it's very rainy and the yard is filled with mud. Are they also trying to bring mud back like the way wasps would to kind of build up their homes? And we never saw it. So we still rest on the idea that there's something in the dung that is particularly useful for them. And it never built up to the point where you had it caked on so much that the entrances were tiny, tiny. But it's still possible. I can't totally eliminate that.
My question is quite similar. I wondered whether the dung could be providing a visual signal so that and it's particularly chosen because it's got fibres in it, so it's quite easy to mould and make look three-dimensional. So the bees are actually sculpting the illusion that their colony is well defended by a lot of bees clustering on the outside.
Camouflage. Well, possible. except that the bees have a lot of other signals that help the wasps know, we are here and we're in large numbers. All this hissing and shimmering they do is not really something that the dung can do. It's basically going to have some physical properties and some chemical properties, not these visual and auditory properties. So possible, but not our on the top of our suspect list, I would say. And can I say, okay, I just really want to thank everyone at the National Honey Show for having me here. This is my last of 4 talks, and I really appreciate, the show's beautiful, first of all, and the views are gorgeous, but it's so nice to have such an attentive audience. You guys are really paying attention. I am well trained to recognize sleepy faces, and I know you're paying attention, and your questions are just fabulous. They're really great, really intuitive questions. So thank you for your attention over the last couple of days and for having me here.